naked shorts. I'm not talking the nice kind of naked shorts, not the kind that fine gentlemen would wear strolling around in their house as should be done, but the malicious, nefarious, and illegal kind. There are many people out there, guys, friends, family, fellow gorillas, that would mock and essentially say, look, this is a conspiracy theory. This is not something that happens. It would take way too many parties to coordinate something like that, such as you can see right here with our favorite man on planet Earth, Charles Gasparino, who says the father of the naked shorting conspiracy, Patrick Byrne, has been noticeably silent on it now. And funnily enough, this is something I mentioned in yesterday's video, but I want to dive into this more so because it really is significant information, more so than I think people realize. There's data that came out essentially saying, look, this is a company that was in fact naked short sold. This is the CEO right here. If I butcher his name, I apologize. I went to college for nutrition. We got A's for writing our name on the test, right? It's pretty straightforward stuff. But Yaniv, off to a bad start. Yaniv Sarig says here, preliminary data on illegal naked short selling is in about 7 million shares as of October 15th. This is in addition to the 8.1 million shares officially short as reported by the NASDAQ. Now, if you're a new viewer, you don't know what naked short selling is, I'll walk you through the process and put it in a very simple way. But essentially what this is saying is that 8.1 million shares were officially registered as short by the NASDAQ. There's an additional 7 million that were not accounted for, meaning that they should not be there. And in and of itself, that's pretty bad. That should not be something that exists for a prolonged period of time. And I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about it today because that is important stuff to be able to mention. So what I want to talk about, the most important thing is how can something like this happen? Because when you think of naked short selling in and of itself, you might just think to yourself, bad hedge fund, bad person, right? They just decide, screw this company, let's dig it into the ground. But you can't be that straightforward as to sort of just create shares out of thin air and send them into the market shorted and expect that you're not going to get caught, right? Because a lot of this stuff is done via computers, via algorithms, and it's logged, right? That sort of stuff can be found by investigating bodies such as the SEC down the road if there was an investigation to be done. Now, obviously the SEC is kind of, well, I shouldn't say they're not very proactive, more reactive than anything regarding this sort of situation, but think of this in a much larger sort of way. I broke this down into sort of 3 categories here, and I'm going to be talking explicitly about shares, options, which are contracts that are written up by market makers, essentially liquidity or money providers within the stock market, and then actual naked short selling in and of itself. So right here in this circle, what do you have, right? This is a hypothetical stock. This in no way is a representation of anything. This is a theoretical sort of situation based on the things that present themselves in the stock market. Let's say you have a 100 million share float. What that essentially means is there's 100 million shares of total stock that exists on a day-to-day basis within the stock market as long as the company does not add additional shares to that overall count. So if somebody was to own 100 million shares and they didn't sell a single one of those, that means there's nothing available to trade, right? With that being said, hypothetically speaking, let's say retail owns 45 million shares. Toots or institutions, the big boys, hedge funds, banks, whatever, they own 25 million shares. And then there's 25 million shares shorted into the market. I've added a small sliver right here for market makers as well. And I'm going to dig into that a little bit more, but essentially think of this as their own internalized portfolio and holdings in that stock, anticipating things that could happen, right? Maybe a potential buyer, maybe a call option runs in the money, as I'm going to get into here in a little bit, right? They just have their own liquidity in that given security so that they can handle that in any sort of way that they'd like to. Kind of this small circle over here is naked short selling. And why I mentioned earlier in the video, it's not super easy to get away with something like this is because you have to have some sort of reason behind naked shorting a stock if you're going to do it. Now, it's not technically illegal unless it's malicious or nefarious. And what I would define that as personally is if you do not have the supply, for example, let's say that there is, you got a market maker right here or a hedge fund who says, okay, I know that I have 5 million shares returning, but it's not until tomorrow. So what I'm going to do for now is naked short 5 million shares into the market, this being the market right here, anticipating that 5 million shares will come back, and I will essentially wipe these naked shorts out of the market, right? It's essentially an exchange. But the timeliness, right? Hanging on to naked shorts for a prolonged period of time, that to me is nefarious because it identifies you had no intention, the least bit, of actually getting rid of those, right? And they circulate in the market and they can dilute stock price, supply and demand. We can talk about that a little more, but I want to get into where I think the majority of the problem is and where the problem was for this specific security, which was ATER, and that is in derivatives. Now, why is this important, right? Well, if you're to look at ATER specifically, this is a lower float stock, right? It's got about 30-ish million share float. As you can see right here by Webull, this is 29.3 million total share float for the stock. And with that small of a float and with how heavily this stock was traded and how heavy the short interest was, this stock had a 30-40% short interest the last time that I checked. It's very easy for things to get out of hand very quickly if there's momentum. And with that being said, there was heavy derivatives trading during this peak period right here when it ran up to about $19.90. So why is this important, right? Why does it matter that there is heavy derivatives activity? Well, it's because this is a way where things can get out of hand for not only market makers, but hedge funds as well. So here's a hypothetical situation with a hypothetical stock. There's a 100 million share float and all 100 million shares are accounted for. These are traded on a day-to-day basis. That's how the stock decides what it wants to do on a given day. Throw in derivatives all of a sudden, right? Let's say that you have a 300,000 total calls in the market, as is very possible with a stock that has such heavy derivatives activity, essentially contracts that are written up by market makers saying, I think a stock is going to go up to this, or I think a stock is going to go down to this, put very simply, right? $300,000 worth of, or 300,000 contracts worth of calls equivalent to 30 million shares. One contract is worth 100 shares. You multiply 300,000 by 100, you get 30 million. In the same way, you've got 100,000 total puts or 10 million shares worth if those were to all run in the money. Now, here's a hypothetical situation, right? Let's say that the cap for these 300,000 total call option contracts is $10, right? We'll just say it's $10 right here. And all of a sudden, stock price goes way above that, spikes up to 15. What do you have all of a sudden, right? You've got 300,000 total contracts or 30 million shares worth of contracts that are all in the money simultaneously. And this is a very rare occurrence. It's not something you see frequently, but it does happen. I've seen it in the last 10, 11 months with a couple given stocks, right? ATER being one of them, IRT being another, AMC, GameStop, very obvious, Bed Bath & Beyond, BlackBerry, Nokia, right? There's a ton of stocks in which this is very, very doable and possible to have happened. Now, the problem here is this. In this hypothetical situation, if a market maker has 5 million shares on hand, but 30 million shares all of a sudden run in the money, they have to prepare for the chance of all 300,000 of these contracts getting exercised. And they don't have that on hand. They've got 5 million shares, which can absolutely skyrocket the price up. And in a situation where this can happen, you can have two sort of parties at fault here. Market makers who wrote up these contracts in the first place have to hedge against these contracts, right? Either they have to manage their exposure for the long and the short side, depending on which way the stock decides to go. So they can buy stock as well as short the stock because they have to manage that risk and that exposure. They play the game of break even, right? They're trying to essentially manage volatility when that volatility comes to be. So market makers can write up naked shorted shares into the market if they don't have the supply, saying, look, this is a failure to deliver, or look, we anticipate shares will return so we can make this happen. And sometimes they just don't get delivered. In the case of something like this, right? This is my speculation based on what I watched happen. I choked on my spit. When the stock ran up to $19 back here, right? Back on September 13th. That's one opportunity. That's one option. Another one's this. Hedge funds can write up naked shorts. And this is a less likely and more complicated sort of situation because the relationship between a hedge fund has to go through a market maker, at least to some extent, or some sort of broker, which then goes to a market maker. So it has to go by a lot of people. You have to have a situation where there's multiple parties at fault, which ultimately comes back to market makers who oversee all these transactions and all the liquidity in the first place. So what do I think caused this? What could have really caused that 7 million shares sold short, which doesn't sound like a big deal, right? But that is a huge deal. It's a huge deal because this company has a 30 million share float, 29 million, which means you're increasing the overall share count of this stock significantly, nearly 30%, nearly a third, which dilutes stock price. If you have more shares circulating in a float, right, what ends up happening? lowers the stock price. It just does. It's supply and demand. If all of a sudden you have this huge influx of supply, right? Supply just goes through the roof. Inversely, demand will just go down. That's the relationship because it's selling pressure. That in and of itself is selling pressure. Think of the car market, right? Think of the used car market right now. What do you see, right? Car market, there's a shortage in terms of chip. There's a supply chain issue. You just see that there's really not a lot of opportunity to get new cars. I can speak on this because my roommate, Alpaca, tried buying a Subaru and it took him forever to get that new Subaru, right? Whatever. That causes used cars price to go through the roof because there's limited supply in other markets, which increases demand. In the same way with this, right? Increasing supply, you're going to lower demand. It synthetically lowers stock price. ATER got fucked. I mean, it just got anally fisted and it's right there in front of your faces. And I think this is one of many stocks where a situation like this happens. To me, it's all hidden. It's all hidden in this. Where all the malpractice takes place is in unregulated derivatives markets, right? Market makers, options market makers, being able to write up more contracts than they really should. Because they can write up an infinite amount of contracts if they so desire, as long as they think they can deliver on them. And obviously, in some situations, these guys are just making shit up as they go. They're sitting there like, oh, you know what, Jim over here, this looks like a gimme, right? He's playing a freaking $20 call option on a stock that's at $5. Yeah, why wouldn't I take that free premium? And most of the time, they're gonna hit that. But sometimes they do not. Sometimes they get clapped. Sometimes they get woken up by being pissed on. And market makers get stuck in a situation where they have no choice but to do things like this. Or like this. 7 million shares, right? It's crazy stuff. And these are things that retail investors and apes have been banging their head against the wall about for literally months, almost a year, guys. And it's there. It's in front of your faces. These are theories that have literally come true. That naked short selling does take place. The process behind that, I think, is important to understand. And the parties involved, I think, are also important to understand because there are a couple different ways that can happen. But I think the primary problem and where there's the most opportunity for friction and bad decision making comes down to the guys at the top who handle the money, market makers. They oversee transactions outside of clearinghouses, but that's entirely separate, right? I'm not going to get too much into that. But they oversee this stuff, which means they have to allow it to happen. And it's some wild stuff. So what's the takeaway, right? Speaking out against this stuff, speaking about it, having these conversations and trying to discuss how this can happen in the first place raises the opportunity for other people out there to see this and to affect change. Is being able to recognize and get the word out and make noise against stuff like this. Because true, maybe you have no skin in the game with ATER. No. I know I don't, right? But it still affects people's lives. It affects the company. It affects the people who work for the company. It affects the people who invested in the company. It's theft. It's straight up theft. It's illegal. It's not right. It's fucked up. And talking about it is a start. That's what I've got for you guys. Catch you on the next one. Much love, like taps. Peace.